Got now the great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Rosie Atkins, former curator of the Chelsea Physic Gardens, who retired in 2010 to actually return to writing and also follow her horticultural interest. Rosie has written for Today, the Sunday Times, has actually launched and edited Gardens Illustrated magazine, is also a fellow of the Linnean Society, chairman of the London Gardens Network, launched in 2008. She lives between London and East Sussex. She will now, in the next 20 minutes, to give us what Fischli Weiss would call plötzlich diese Übersicht, suddenly this overview. She will give us in 20 minutes a history of garden design. A very warm welcome to Rosie Atkins.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Hans. For me, gardens begin and end with people. And in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to illustrate how gardens have been man's largest, perhaps even greatest works of art, as Wolfgang illustrated, and how we connect through gardens with nature over the millennium. Now, Hans has said that there's, I think, did I hear 1,200 different notions of gardens, window boxes, I mean, like guerrilla gardening. I mean, there's just endless. They cover hundreds of hectares, or could be Wolfgang's window box. They include areas around the heritage sites, and they also can include small holdings that provide food for families. And we know that gardens provide sustenance, therapy, and pleasure, but I'm going to concentrate on the insight that they give to our cultural history. And I'm a bit worried about the slides because I couldn't sadly see Wolfgang's slides terribly well. And my talk rather depends on slides as well. So let's see what comes up. If I was to ask you what the oldest garden you could think of in the world would be, what would you say? Come on, historians amongst you. Well, that's very good, Julia. Anything that's kind of even more Seven Wonders of the World-ish? Well, I'm pleased. That's a lovely connection. Actually, I'm thinking, my thought was that you'd say the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And now I'm just filling in time, as you can see. Now, that's the number one.
Tag through.
Just go that way.
Just go forward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know if you can see that. It's terribly faint. But the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are really sort of mythical. And experts argue whether they even existed. They were supposed to have been built in 600 BC by Nebuchadnezzar, who we all remember as well from the songs. But it could have been built in Nineveh 100 years later. But wherever that garden was built, one thing we're sure of is that it was built as a symbol of power. And I'm rather interested in this couple that is seen here on a limestone relief dated 1330. It's an Egyptian couple, probably royal. And I thought that they might just have given us that connection with Adam and Eve, as Julia mentioned. I was in Egypt just before the Arab Spring, and I was fascinated by the links that I saw in early Christianity. There were women cradling babies with halos, and the resurrection story was very much based on Egyptian symbolism and ideas. And I'm wondering if this royal couple could have had that link with the biblical story of Adam and Eve. And here we have Adam and Eve, Julia. And in a garden which was the European version of a garden, really, which was a garden that united the earthly and the divine. The enclosed garden of Peter Zumthor's ideals, the Hortus Conclusus, an allegory for paradise or a lost Eden. Very much a Persian idea, and I'm now going to go to a garden that not many of you will have heard. Can you hear me all right? Heard of. This is a garden that I got very excited by when I saw it. It's the recently excavated site of Sigiriya in Sri Lanka. I don't know if anyone's ever been there, but it's a World Heritage Site, and it's the world's oldest surviving landscape garden. it probably was a prehistoric settlement, and by the 5th century BC, and we're talking pre-Mayhem, really ancient, it was a Buddhist monastery. And I'm really interested in this kind of cultural history, gardens that link to faith, is my theme at the moment. By 470 BC, a powerful king came along and saw this iconic site and created a complex fortress city. And I don't know if you can see that it's got incredible symmetry. It also included wonderful pools for his 500 wives. Must have taken most I've ever heard of yet, actually. But I have a feeling that this garden would have inspired any Roman or Persian trader who would have seen them. I've been to China, as many of you have, and it's amazing to just connect that the gardens of Suzhou are around the same time. 500 BC, Chinese were creating gardens in Suzhou, but their geography and probably security issues kept them much of a secret from the Europeans. But I think this is Hampton Court. I think it was Henry VIII who was really the trailblazer for garden design in Britain. We were really very slow to start catching up with the Europeans. But you see from Hampton Court here, you've got the quadrant at the front of the palace, reflecting that ordered universe. And I was just saying to Stella that we didn't actually get our first botanic garden here until 1621 with Oxford. The Italians were way ahead of us. And the Dutch, I should say, as well. And this is Sigiriya again, a bit more greened up. But you see that symmetry, which is really a motif that stayed with garden design really up to modern times. But we know, with all those different notions of gardens, that they are an expression of personal style, whether you're rich and famous or not. In the 17th and 18th century in England, most pleasure-filled Arcadias were exclusively the playground for the rich. That is, until Jonathan Tyers created Vauxhall Gardens. And here we have, you sort of notice the symmetry again. I hope you can see this. They were created in 1752, and for 200 years, this astonishing entrepreneur changed, I think, our way of looking at gardens. For 1 shilling, you could go inside and eat, be entertained by musicians. Handel played there. You could see new art. You could watch exotic live wire acts. And Charles II found it a good spot for picking up mistresses. It was eventually sold in the 1800s, and sadly, it's now reduced to a short cut to the Oval Cricket Ground. But I think Jonathan's pleasure garden may have been the kickstart to many of the modern theme parks. Now, Julia, in her introduction, gave a very good background to the Kensington Gardens, which, this is the revelries going on in the Vauxhall Gardens. I mean, incredibly, can you see it? I mean, just amazing, sophisticated. Now, Julia said Kensington Gardens were carved out of Hyde Park by Henry Wise and Charles Bridgman around the 1730s. However, this picture, if you can see it, is what it looked like when it was painted by John Linnell in 1811 using a camera obscura. It looks like a desert for those of you who can't see it, and I think it's obviously a bit that Wise and Bridgman hadn't got to. But here is, you can't really see it, but here's Kensington Gardens as we know it today, with the round pond, the Serpentine, Italian Gardens, and of course the Fountain Garden commemorating the life of Princess Diana. Now, in the news recently, we saw that the work continues at Ground Zero on the Memorial Gardens, which includes 2 large reflecting pools, and they include the largest man-made waterfall ever. Now, both this and Princess Diana's garden have been created to bring people together to remember a tragic moment. But interestingly, that even the Memorial Gardens of the Twin Towers echoes this simple fresco of the 18th dynasty from Egypt, of a pond surrounded by date palms and trees. Somehow you think that there's nothing new in our feelings for gardens, and that you could probably sense that you're coming up to the 20th century and the 21st, where more people are living in cities and we're feeling as if we've got to make that connection more powerfully with nature. I think my favourite example of urban greening is the High Line, which is Pete Aldorf's planting, and here are chaps at work planting that garden, which if you haven't already been there or seen reference to it, it's planted on a redundant railway track in New York. And it probably has transformed the lives of those living near it and probably raised the real estate value as well. Another aspect of gardens, good gardens. And appropriately, Hans was mentioning garden marathon. Well, I think the Olympic Games is coming upon us very soon. And I'm on a steering committee of something called Mad About Meadows, which will encourage people from all over the country to plant urban meadows. Now, 95% of the meadow habitats in this country has disappeared since the last war, and that has resulted in a terrific loss of wildflowers and native habitat for animals. And of the thousands of children that come to the Physic Garden every year, I was always astonished to realise that they didn't even know where a carrot came from, and the head of education used to quite often start his talk with, who of you have eaten a plant for breakfast? And there would be absolute sort of completely baffled faces. And when it comes to meadows, well, hay meadows, I mean, not many of us see those these days. So it's an interesting project, though I think the purists in the horticultural world might say that meadows are probably the most specific of habitats and might in fact be the most difficult to recreate. But I'm going to just finish. I hope I'm sort of somewhere near the 20 minutes, because I've never given a 20-minute talk before, but I usually ramble on for at least an hour. Well, I'm forgetting the pictures too, because there's the Olympic site, and in fact there are children from the local schools around the East End planting up meadows, and I think any of you go to the Lord Mayor's show, there's going to be meadows going through the streets. And one hopes that it's an idea it will really pick up, and it's a great collaboration with other organisations like Plant Life, Bug Life, etc. So these things, another example of gardens bringing people together. And this is probably one of my favourite images from my talks I used to give at the Physic Garden. This was a picture found in Baghdad in 1214, and it's of Dioscorides, who was a Greek army surgeon who served in the Roman army. And consequently saw a lot of the nasty wounds and things, and he was very observant of local flora and fauna, and created the first Materia Medica, which is a list of plants which have medicinal uses. And here he is giving his assistant a botany lesson, and I think that Materia Medica, it always astonished me that it was the foundation for our plant-based medicines for nearly 1,600 years. Astonishing. We've been incredibly slow at some things. But in our long history of garden making, I know that we all know that we wouldn't exist without plants. And whatever gardens look like in the future, they will continue to bring people together wherever they live in the world, and mark out our dependence on that nature. And it's very, very important, I think, as the lady said, look at your neighbours, the soil and the earth, and be thankful. Thank you.